Hi, my name is Catherine Moore, and the other aliases that I used to go by were Kay Dowden. Dowden was my maiden name, and um, my first marriage, I went by Kay Anthony or Catherine Anthony. I didn't really start going by Catherine until my divorce, and I have many stories to tell. I grew up in the United Methodist denomination, and I moved around to a lot of rural areas, small towns. My father was a minister, and before that, he was an alcoholism counselor. And he was also a child predator, but it took me decades to figure that out. And the reason why it took me so long to figure that out is because it was all I knew. And I did not have anything to compare my childhood to. Abusers want to keep you isolated so that you are not aware that you are being abused. They want to keep you isolated so that you have nothing to compare your life to. And if you do not have anything to compare your life to, it's kind of hard to point out uh, what is wrong in your life. You may have a nagging feeling that something isn't right, but you really will not be able to pinpoint it until you're wiser. Some people continue to live in ignorance and denial. I am not one of those people who lives in ignorance and denial. I grew up in mostly rural Northeast Texas, but I moved around a lot. My father became a United Methodist minister in probably in the mid 1980s, early to mid 1980s. And my parents were very sick. I was raised by monsters. People really did not have any idea how sick and twisted my parents were behind closed doors. My father could make some of the sickest behaviors seem normal, kind of like what we are experiencing in this country today with people that are conservative and with Donald Trump. It's very similar to that. I see a lot of my father in Donald Trump and in his behavior. My father, his name was John Dowden, and he attended New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. And he also attended East Texas Baptist College, which is now known as East Texas Baptist University. My mother did not finish college. She worked odd jobs to help my father finish school. My father's first victim regarding sexual assault was his sister, and she chose to remain silent about that up until I was probably almost 40. And that is when I called her to speak to her about my father. And her response to me was that John always had weird behavior. I think weird was putting it mildly. I think my father had behavior that was far more sinister and slimy and just sickening. And weird was just not a description I would have used. I could handle weird. Weird is okay, but his behavior was just appalling and disgusting. My parents were two of the most disgusting people I have ever met. I have never met anybody more disgusting than they were. My dad's sister told me what my father did. He was 7 years older than her, and He wanted her to kiss him. I figured this probably the time frame for when this happened, when he forced himself on her. She was either a little girl or she was an adolescent. She never told me exactly how old she was when this happened. She chose to remain silent to maintain a relationship with extended family. I chose to speak out at the expense of losing a relationship with my extended family because I could not stand the thought of living a life of repeatedly being violated and slimed and humiliated by other family members who um, wanted to indulge in being sexually inappropriate with me. And that is why I really do not have a relationship with my extended family today. My father was very manipulative, and my mother was also. They were very cunning and sneaky and slimy. They were very persuasive with people. My parents were good, always very good at always getting somebody to rescue them. They were terrible with money. They were terrible with cars. And the fact that my father was a minister, a Methodist minister for a good part of my life, it was very convenient because when money was tight and they did not have enough money for bills or they did not have enough money for car repairs, they could always get church members to bail them out financially. And my father, when I found out that my father had sexually assaulted his sister, I knew then that he had been a predator before I was born. And that was eye-opening for me because for a long time, I actually thought that I was the one that caused him to be that way. I thought that I blamed myself and I felt that I was responsible for his behavior. And when I found out about his sister and what he did to her, I knew then that I was not the one that made my father a sexual predator. He was born that way. My father used to talk about how he wanted to be a United Methodist minister. Well, he wasn't a Methodist minister. He was a United Methodist minister, sorry, but he wanted to be a minister from the time that he was a child. Religion and Christianity, the evangelical world, was very convenient for my father. The evangelical culture is very convenient for any sexual predator because they usually know exactly what to say. I mean, it's not very hard to walk into any type of evangelical culture and manipulate people and con people because of their beliefs. And because in the evangelical world, they put a lot of faith and purpose in their beliefs regarding God and the Son of Christ. I mean, God and the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And if you believe in Jesus Christ, that he died for your sins, and you believe in God, then you know you're okay. There's nothing wrong with you. I mean, you're automatically considered a good person in the evangelical world if you know exactly what to say and you can walk in saying, I believe that Jesus Christ died for my sins. He died on the cross and God sacrificed his son so that I could live. You are accepted in the evangelical community. People in the evangelical world are very gullible and easily influenced if you know how to have the right dialogue with them. My father knew how to use that. He knew how to con people in the evangelical community, in the Baptist denomination. He knew how to con people in any type of evangelical denominational setting. And my father was an excellent public speaker. He was very eloquent with words, and he knew how to move a congregation to tears, how to have an effect on their emotions, especially in a Sunday service. He could also cry on demand. He was not afraid to open the water gates and cry in his sermons to manipulate the congregation. And he would also tell me stories about how he used to baptize cats and kittens. And at the time, that's how he explained it. And I realized decades later that that is really not what he was doing. He was drowning cats, because he would tell me that he would baptize cats and kittens when he was a kid, and he would make it sound like it, what, like every now and then one of them would drown, and he would make it sound like it really wasn't the big deal that it was. And as a child, I had nothing to compare it to, and I really didn't know. It wasn't something I remembered and just openly discussed with people, because when I was a child, I was very quiet, which is exactly what my parents wanted. I didn't really tell anybody much of anything, and I was not trusting of anyone at all. And I really didn't have a childhood. I had to learn things that most children should not have to learn in their childhood. I didn't feel like a child, and I felt like there was something wrong with me because I did not feel like a child. And my father pastored a small little church. It was either in Carthage or Tenaha. I can't remember. We lived in either Carthage or Tenaha, and I attended school in either Carthage or Tenaha. And then before that, my father pastored Hall Baptist Church. I was passed around a lot as a young child. My mother was not a very attentive mother when I was young. When my father pastored Hall Baptist Church, there was a woman named Miss Preston, and I would sit with Miss Preston every Sunday. I didn't sit with my mother. I sat with Miss Preston. And I never really asked my mother why. I really think that it was because my mother was happy to pass me off onto someone else. And my mother really didn't want me sitting with her in church. And Miss Preston had a daughter-in-law named Jeannie. And Jeannie would take care of me. There was another family there that would also take care of me, and they had a son that was close to my age, and his name was Corey. And Corey and I would play a lot. And Corey had two teenage sisters that would also take care of me at times. I remember spending a lot of time with Miss Preston. I would spend the night at Miss Preston's house a lot. And the days that I was at home with my mother, she really didn't do much with me. I remember she watched soap operas a lot if she was at home during the day. She really did not have any interest in um, talking to me or spending time with me. I played by myself a lot. And after we moved from after we left Marshall and lived in Tinnehaw and Carthage. And then after Tinnehaw or Carthage, my parents decided to move to Amarillo. And my father took a job at a hospital as a chaplain intern in Amarillo. Before that, my father had worked and received clinical training at Rusk State Hospital, and he would counsel child molesters at Rusk State Hospital. That was very convenient for him because he was a child molester himself. And so, because he was able to counsel child molesters at Rusk State Hospital, he blended in quite well. And once we got to Amarillo, we stayed in like a guest room in the hospital until my parents were able to find an apartment. My mother would take me to the doctor a lot. My mother had a habit of telling people. My mother had Munchausen by proxy, and what I mean by that is that she would tell people that I was developmentally behind. Any developmental delay I had was probably because of the lack of time she spent with me, and also probably because that's what she wanted. And when I was young, there were frequent urinary tract infections, which once I became an adult, decades later, I realized was a common symptom of being sexually abused by my father. And my mother knew it. My mother supported my father in sexually abusing me and assisted him in the sense of they drugged me. That started happening. It has started happening before that. My mother was giving me a medication when I was young, before we had moved to Amarillo, and it was some type of grape flavored medication, and I don't know what it was. And I remembered she kept giving it to me every day. And it could have been some type of cough syrup to sedate me. I never really got a chance to ask her that. And so I'm winging this and I'm trying to remember things as I go. So I'm going to do the best I can with this. And I am going somewhere with this eventually. And once we got to Amarillo, there were more health issues that were also caused by my parents. And I had to undergo vaginal examinations at the doctor. My mother would instigate that. And she basically wanted them to think that there was something wrong with me, that I was flawed. That way, if the physicians and the medical staff thought that, oh well, there's not a health issue. There's not a medical health issue here. This child is just flawed. Because in my mother's mind, if the medical staff thought that I was just flawed, they weren't going to suspect that I was being sexually abused at home. And my mother wanted people to be under the illusion that I was slow, that I was cognitively behind, and I just basically didn't know a whole lot about what was going on or what I was feeling. And back in the 80s, doctors really didn't talk to children in the hospital like you were a person. You were nothing. I was nothing. And I remember being humiliated. It was degrading. I went through horrific medical exams. And what my mother had told me, and I never saw the medical records, by the time I realized what had happened and what had probably been going on, the statute of limitations had passed and the medical records had been thrown out because they had become so old. And my mother had said that, and I don't remember when it was that she had told me that the reason why I'd had to have vaginal surgery and go through those medical exams um, was because I had a vaginal tumor. I to Knowing what I know now, I doubt that it was a vaginal tumor. I think that there was physical damage done from being sexually assaulted by my father. And there are clues later on that I found out. And the sexual abuse started from the time that I was a newborn. My mother knew that my father was a sexual predator, and when she had me, she said that she couldn't take care of me because she had had a C-section, which was a lie. She did have a C-section, but I knew that that was a lie. She just didn't want to take care of me. And my father took care of me, and that was very convenient for him because he was a child molester. So who was going to question him? And who was going to question my mother? No one. Absolutely no one. Because my parents were in the evangelical culture, and they were Baptist, and my father was going to seminary. So who was going to suspect a Baptist minister was a child molester? And so that I realized by the time that I was in my 30s, the sexual assault from my father started way before I was 9 years of age, because I used to think that it started at 9. But I eventually figured out that because my father was a sexual predator before I was born, and I was not his first victim, it started from the time that I was a newborn, from the time that I came into this world. And so, because of that, I never had a chance infancy and childhood was not normal for me, but I had nothing to compare that to. And because that was all I knew, there was no way that I could suspect that anything was wrong. I felt that something was wrong, and my way of processing that is, of course, there's something wrong because there's something wrong with me. And I remember even as a young child, even before Amarillo, there were certain types of clothes I didn't want to wear. I didn't like to wear sweatpants because I felt that my butt jiggled, which, you know, for a 5-year-old, like that's not normal. I had an awareness of my body that I should not have had. And I am okay talking about this because this is my story and it's mine to tell. And I made a decision when I began my healing journey and my recovery, which is going to be lifelong, that I was not going to live in denial and that I was going to face everything head on. One of the most important lessons I learned in the beginning of my journey of healing and discovery and recovery is there were people who did tell me, well, you know, you have to deal with those repressed memories. You have to deal with your abuse. You have to face that. And that was their way of making sure that I understood that they were above me mentally, they were above me emotionally, they were above me spiritually. And I didn't want to face it. And because I didn't want to face it, then I was met with, well, you have to face it. And then when I decided, okay, I'm going to deal with this and I'm going to lay hold of it and I'm going to address what has happened to me and I am going to own it because it's not going to own me. It's not going to run my life. Then those same people that said, well, you have to deal with this, all of a sudden didn't want me to deal with it. And the reason why people do that is because they're afraid that you are going to outgrow them emotionally because they're on a pedestal when they're telling you, well, you have to deal with this and, you know, you have to face what happened to you because they're looking down on you. And when you do finally decide to deal with it, and that's not okay, that is because that is intimidating to anyone that is looking down on you because of something that was done to you that was out of your control, that you never consented to. And so I was met with a lot of that when I began to just take control of it and say, I'm going to deal with this. And I was met with many people who all of a sudden didn't want me to face the so-called demons of my abuse, such as family and people in the United Methodist denomination. And when we were living in Amarillo and My father had been fired at the hospital that he had been working in the chaplaincy program there. Probably, I don't know for sure, but I think that he was terminated because of misconduct. And there was this real pretty secretary that worked there, I remember. And I remember my father telling her that she was the most beautiful secretary in the world right in front of my mother, which my mother was not thrilled about. I remember that night. And I think that that had something to do with the fact that my father had been fired in the chaplaincy program there. Shortly after that, my parents had attempted to, they bought a house, and my father decided to go into the United Methodist denomination. And he became employed by under the Northwest Texas Conference up in the Panhandle. And his first assigned church within that conference was the First Methodist Church, Groom, Texas. The First United Methodist Church, Groom, Texas. And also, there was a major split in the church, and I will cover that further down the road. So, some of the churches that my father pastored have since separated from the United Methodist denomination. And during the time that my parents made the move into Groom, Texas, Groom is a very tiny, small town. And the school probably could have been a 2A or 1A school, I'm guessing. I would also act out as a child, and I didn't understand why, and I internalized it as something is wrong with me. And that's certainly what my mother wanted people to think, because she and my father didn't want anybody to look at them. There were people, especially a family that we were friends with, and I would play with their kids in Marshall, Texas. And they had suspected that I had been sexually abused, and my parents denied that I had. They said, "Oh no, she hasn't." And basically what my mother wanted to make it seem like is that I was acting out because there's just something wrong with me. Um and because that's what my mother wanted people to believe, then I took it on and I internalized it, and I believed the same thing about myself. I would say that I still struggle with that belief that there's something wrong with me, but I think now I have a different perspective on it. And um, when we moved, I started having more health issues when we moved to Groom. And I had developed pneumonia, and some doctor in Amarillo prescribed codeine for my parents to give me. And the problem with the codeine is that I couldn't keep anything down. It would make me sick. But this was very convenient for my parents because they discovered they could use the codeine. My mother could use the codeine to keep me sick. And both of my parents realized that they could use the codeine to sedate me so that I would not know that my father was sexually assaulting me, sexually abusing me. What happened is that he did it while I was asleep because my parents were too stupid to realize that the body keeps score. When it comes to trauma, the body keeps score. when it comes to any type of abuse, any type of physical, sexual, emotional abuse, the body keeps score. And my body kept score. And my parents made the assumption that because this was going on when I was not cognitively aware, that no harm would be done because I wouldn't remember. So, how could I talk? How could I tell anybody what my father was doing if I didn't know it was going on? And they didn't think about when my father began to sexually abuse me once I got older, that I would begin to speak up. But it took a long time. And my mother would give me the codeine to sedate me. One, because she didn't want to deal with me. And two, was also so that it could make me sick, to keep me sick, because they were getting attention and getting sympathy from people. I remember being lethargic. I was lethargic and groggy from the sedation. I was lethargic because I couldn't keep anything down. And the reason why I couldn't keep anything down was because my mother kept giving me the codeine. And I would throw up after she would give me the codeine, and then she would give me the codeine again. And if that didn't work, then she would put the codeine in my food, like strawberry ice cream. She knew that my favorite ice cream was strawberry ice cream. And so they put the codeine in the strawberry ice cream because I couldn't keep it down that night. This was during the move when my parents were getting the house ready to sell in Amarillo. And I remember that night, my mother had given me the codeine and I couldn't keep it down. And so she went over to the neighbor's house and got strawberry ice cream, and she put it in the ice cream. When she came back, I was sitting in my dad's lap in the bed, and my mother was facing me, sitting in front of me. And I remember the look on my mother's face, and I remember the tone of her voice, and something just wasn't right, but I couldn't begin to tell you what it was. It just felt off. And there was nowhere to go. And my mother started feeding me that strawberry ice cream, and I remember it felt off. The taste was not right. And she was determined. I just remember her talking to me and coaching me, just wanting to make sure that she could get that codeine in me so that I would just be knocked out. And what happened after that, I cannot tell you. I did ask her about it later, and I did get a confession on recording, and it is on this podcast. And my mother's words to me that night, I will never forget. I said, "You think this is a joke?" And her response to me was, "Kay, you are a joke." And this was in 2017. It was March of 2017. There were several chilling conversations with her about the fact that she and my father had drugged me with codeine so that my father could sexually assault me. And I don't think that my mother, I know my mother didn't think that I would remember that. I know she didn't expect me to begin to ask questions about that and to begin to put pieces together about what had been happening during that time in Groom and in Amarillo. I have not, since we left Groom and Amarillo, I have not been back there. And I honestly don't know if I could go. I certainly could not make that trip alone. And I have no idea how I would be able to handle going back to the Panhandle, going back to Amarillo and Groom. I'm sure it would look very different. And I haven't really, I've thought about going back um because I am completely open to continuing to grow and face what happened to me and continue to own it, for healing to take place. Because for me, this is going to be a lifelong journey. And what I learned in my healing journey is that when I was met with people who wanted me to face it, and then when I made the decision to face what had happened to me and to own it and to lay hold of it and um, to take responsibility for my healing, I think what scared me was uh, the thought of abandonment. What if there's no one left? I couldn't, how could I survive that if I lose everyone? And I did lose everyone pretty much. Um, and there is healing in that, as devastating as it is. And I gained strength from that. And after we moved to Amarillo, after we moved to Groom, we had moved into the Methodist Parsonage, which is a house that is it was owned by the United Methodist Church in Groom, Texas. And my parents were still using the codeine to accomplish what they wanted, to keep me sick, to keep me weak, to use it as an opportunity to get attention from other people, to make people think that I was just a very sick child. And also, so that my father could accomplish what he wanted with me, so that I would not remember. And so that that would protect their dirty little secret behind closed doors. My parents stopped. I did ask my mother back in 2017, I said, "Why'd you stop?" She never really gave me an answer. And what I think happened, I think people were beginning to ask questions. And I think that's why my parents stopped. My parents had been confronted by medical staff in a hospital before they had moved to Groom, because the medical staff had told my parents they suspected I had been sexually abused. And once again, my parents denied it, said no, she's not been sexually abused. And CPS was never contacted, and this was back in the 80s. So unfortunately, those physicians and medical staff failed me. And I remember being in, kindergarten and the first grade, and I did not feel like a little girl as young as 6 and 7 years of age. There was a woman named Miss Neal, and she would make me dresses, and I wanted these frilly dresses. And she would make these frilly dresses with lace, and I loved them because I could twirl around. And in that moment that I had one of the dresses on that she made me, I felt like a little girl. And I couldn't understand why uh, what it was that was wrong. I felt like, well, there's just something wrong with me and God hates me. There's something wrong with me and God is punishing me. And that is how I internalized what was going on during that time. My mother would take me to a therapist, but it wasn't because she wanted to help me. It was because she um, wanted people to think that there was something wrong with me. That way nobody would look at them. And the therapist she took me to was a male. It was back in Amarillo. It should not have been a male therapist because I was a little girl, and I was being sexually abused, and a male therapist was the last thing I needed to go to. I spent the first grade in Groom, and it was not a good experience. I also remember I had this fantasy in my mind. I was very passionate about music, and for the first grade is when I first began taking piano lessons. I was very passionate about music and singing and piano, and I would beg my parents to let me sing in the church. And the reason why they didn't let me sing in the church is because they didn't want to shine a positive light on me, because it would not have it would have conflicted with the fact that they wanted people to think that there was something wrong with me. So if, I sang for the church, then that would have been, I would have had positive attention on me. And my parents wanted um people to feel sorry for them. So I had this fantasy when I was a little girl around that time, and I would fantasize about learning how to sing. I would fantasize about having this amazing, beautiful voice. And if I could just, in my mind, I thought if I could just sing, if I could learn how to sing, everybody would love me. And then there would not be anything wrong with me because I would have a beautiful voice. Of course, I learned years later it doesn't work that way. And, but singing and music has been an outlet for me. And I would have to say it was my saving grace, learning to sing and learning to play musical instruments. It was a way for me to express myself. And the only time my parents were interested in supporting my passion for music was only if they could just pass me off to someone else. But they certainly didn't want me to outshine them. I would also act out in school during the first grade, and I felt that I was shamed, and I felt that there was something wrong with me. And it was during that time, the first grade, that I had had vaginal surgery, and I had to wear panty liners as early as the first grade. And that was the first time I had to bring a purse to school in the first grade and bring panty liners to school. And I was expected to bring the panty liner into my teacher and let her see, which I never did because that was just too humiliating. I wasn't going to do that. And I felt that because there had been a problem with hemorrhaging from the surgery, that it was because there was something wrong with me and because God was punishing me. And I think um looking back, I would have taken that little girl into my arms and I would have held her and I would have told her there's nothing wrong with you. And what you are going through and what has happened to you is not your fault. It was a failure of many people. It was a failure of medical staff. It was a failure of my parents. It was a failure of the United Methodist denomination. It was the failure of the Baptist churches not seeing how sick my parents were. It was the failure of people not recognizing that I was being neglected by my parents. And I couldn't see that then, and it took me decades to realize that. My mother had also received psychiatric treatment before we had moved to Groom, and it was when we lived in Marshall. She never really she just said it was depression. As far as what could have been diagnosed with, I have no idea. I had asked her if she was hospitalized because she was suicidal, and she said she was not. And I never really got a direct response out of her as far as why she was hospitalized. She just wanted to gaslight me and say, well, it was because it was where she felt she needed to be at the time. And the truth is that there was nothing wrong with me. The problem was my parents. It wasn't me. And later on, I began to express a lot of anger, especially in my mid-30s. And I couldn't understand why. I was so angry with my mother and I couldn't pinpoint the reason. And I did meet with the bishop, and that was much later, after I'd had my first son. Becoming a mother was also one of my biggest motivating factors to face my abuse. And I was able to face it to a certain point. I still had very deep memories that I still had yet to face and acknowledge. And I just was not ready. And by the time I was in my late 20s, I realized how sick my father was. And After my parents left Groom, we had moved to Stinnett, Texas. Growing up with abuse, what that is like is you are not able to differentiate or put together you've been abused, because not every day is bad. I mean, not every day. I was not abused every single day as far as sexually. It could be one day, it could be emotional abuse, another day, it could be physical abuse, another day, it could be sexual abuse, it could be spiritual abuse. And there were days when there would be good days. Um, so you don't really have it to compare anything to. And throughout my childhood, my mother still continued to slander me and tell people that I was developmentally slow, and that I had her description, what she would tell people is I had emotional problems. I didn't confront her about that until I was probably in my late 30s. And what I told her was that there isn't a medical professional that is going to use the medical term emotional problems as a diagnosis. And that is not something that is listed as a psychiatric condition in the DSM-4. And emotional problems is not listed as a symptom of a psychiatric condition, not in those specific terms, emotional problems. And I don't think my mother ever expected me to begin to put pieces together and confront her about what had happened to me. Once I began to, when I met my first husband and we started dating and we got married, my parents began to become more possessive and controlling because they didn't want me to move on without them. And when my parents died, if they could have taken me with them, they would have. If they thought they could have gotten away with it. And when we were living in Stinnett, we were there for only a year. My dad was not able to stay at any place for very long. And I was under the illusion by that was created by my parents that my parents were always the victims. And that was not true. I think people began to see how sick my parents were, and um, there were red flags that I'm sure that my father showed in his behavior. And so we were in Stinnett for a year. After we lived in Stinnett, my parents moved back to Northeast Texas. And that is when my father became employed under the administration of the Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. and that administration was located in Houston, Texas. I will continue this tomorrow. Thank you for listening.